people are not exactly in the business of giving their members the source material. They're more interested in keeping them as members. You see, here at this particular place, we're a business and we're giving a service. And at any point, people don't want to do that, they can just stop. But this particular thing is entirely free, just based on the fact that we want to be teaching this information to others so that other people can teach this information to their children, their community members, and they can fill in spots like this. And so I'm more curious to ask you guys just if you have anything on your mind that you want to talk about specifically. And then the power of the information that's in here is that it tends to have answers for questions, and unseemingly unrelated questions as well. So you can ask them at virtually anything. This is a free place of speech. The fact that we film any of this for our own content, you guys will not be seen in it. There are no names mentioned. And so it's just a place to have open conversation. Do you guys have anything out of curiosity that you're dealing with in your own life, struggles?
No, I'm not really, but I came here intentionally to learn more about the question of who is God.
Mhm.
That's what I started coming here for, because I felt like I've been in a bad habit of doing all these stuff, being lazy, eating a lot, going out with my friends, disrespecting my parents. And I started coming here so I could learn about Christ and God
Mhm.
and find my right path.
Beautiful. I'd be happy to touch upon that so you can just look at it objectively, right? Most people have a really bad relationship with God because they have expectations that God is supposed to be the way that we want him to be, right? Except we're the ones tailoring to God's picture and to his tune, not the other way around. And so I'm just going to give it real simple. All of this actually originates from a man called Abraham. Obviously, there was a God of the universe who existed. He created the universe. If you believe in the historical timeline, you're just looking at one of two options, basically, that the earth is millions of bazillion years old, and scientists are going to continue adding more and more years, saying, oh yeah, it's 1 billion years old. No, it's 100 billion years old. And then some other guys say, oh, my carbon dating means that it's 1 zillion years old. And none of that really has a lot of good evidence, and these things don't really work. The one that has the most evidence is going to be the Bible. Okay, now the Bible it's a pretty big piece of work because it's broken down into different things. And you said God, and you also said Christ. So I'd be interested in even explaining who that is exactly. So just look at the historical narrative. There was the first man and the woman. God created the earth in 7 days, and then he gave man their purpose. They were kicked out of the garden for going against God's requests. Then they started to flourish and grow and build and do what human beings do, but the entire earth was corrupt. And that extended to everything, all flesh walking on the earth. I think that's something to consider about modern day. It even extends to animals and the character of virtually everything. And God was saddened to his heart, and so he decided to destroy the earth. Yet Noah found grace in the eyes of God. After Noah, who gave mankind a chance at survival again and redemption, 400 years after him, there was one man who essentially started all of this. You know, when by this I mean like Christianity, the Muslim faith, and the Christian faith. And his name is Abraham. Now, who is Abraham? What did he do? Is he the first person that ever spoke with God? No, that's not who Abraham is. Abraham is the first man to follow the way of God without having it written down in literature. And he did something that nobody else was doing, which was following the right way to live objectively. And that allowed him to have a communication with God. And you can read his story, so much so that not only was God communicating with this man, he also made a promise with this man. Now, the promise that he made with this man was, I'm going to make you the father of a multitude of nations. Those who are blessed by you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. And I will give you the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan is Israel. Okay? Now, you go through that man's story. He has a child. Well, he has two children, Ishmael and he has Isaac. Ishmael ends up being the father of the Islamic faith, and Isaac ends up being the father of the Jewish faith. And you can quite literally trace that nation from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. Jacob's name is also Israel. And he had 12 children, the 12 tribes of Jacob. Those 12 tribes of Jacob, now the B'nai means children. Israel is the name of Jacob, right? So the B'nai Israel migrated those descendants to Egypt because there was famine, and his son Joseph was the viceroy who saved the world from famine. And those 70 descendants became a nation of people. That nation of people were called the B'nai Israel, who became enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 years. Then a character called Moses came into the picture as a prophet of God. He was actually a prince of Egypt. He was born a Hebrew, but Moses means drawn from the water. And so he was drawn from the water because they were killing babies and drowning them in the Nile. Not too different to what's going on. Actually, the subject of today that I was trying to do, as opposed to telling this particular story, was actually to talk about the parallel between the modern day and how people are being currently enslaved, right? You basically just overwork them, right? And I think all of us can relate to the fact that we're overworked and it's very hard to make a living, and everybody's got to have like single house income. They can't have children. If you have a PhD, it's not giving you $100,000. And even if it did, you're not going to be able to buy a house, certainly not in 5 years with this sort of economy. And so you also look at the fact that people are quite literally encouraged to get rid of their fetuses. You know, it's hard to say it's a baby necessarily, but there are people who get rid of even their babies, very similar to the Egyptian timeline. Now, as opposed to like jumping back and forth, I'm just going to finish off this narrative for you. So you have that slavery going on. And so Moses was selected by God to be a prophet to speak to Pharaoh and say, let this nation go. And he wasn't willing to do it. So God performed 10 miracles, 10 plagues. And then he took, after the 10th plague where he killed all of their firstborns, the Egyptians had enough. And they said, let this nation go. They left. They tried to pursue them. And God split the Red Sea because they were up against the sea there. And he then closed the sea upon all of the Egyptians, completely saving the Israelites. Now, there's a story of the Israelites that's worth reading. It's actually 4 of the 5 books of Moses. So all those stories about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the first man and the woman is only 1 of the 5 books. And all of it together is only about 210 pages. So as a young man who's seeking God, you should do your due diligence on reading those 260 pages, okay? And it's telling you this story just like I'm saying it. And that nation who was now taken out of slavery was given the 10 commandments. And there was 1 million witnesses, over 1 million witnesses who heard the voice of God claiming the 10 commandments. Now, if you cut much later in history, you have about 500 people confirming the resurrection of Christ. So in terms of who is really has more witnesses, which has more evidence towards it. And Christianity is a wonderful religion, and I believe that God did want the rest of the world to have it, and I can talk about Christ for you as well as a historical figure, but that comes 2,000 years later, okay? So you have this is God. You want to know who God is? This is the story he gave to the earth, and in that story, there's tactical laws of how to treat each other, and that's the most important thing. It's not about religion, it's about the values. You see, I'm a Jew who doesn't like the religious institutions. I absolutely hate them because they're not in the business of showing people who God is and giving them the literature and saying, why do you keep listening to me? Find out yourself. You have the ability to even teach if you want to, right? And that was a commonality in this nation specifically that allowed us to flourish. And usually, in most nations coming together, there's a lot of war and tragedy and evil, but there has to be a question of, was any of it worth it? I would say yes, it was worth it for America. Okay? It was totally worth it for America. It was worth it also for the Israelites because they were told by God to take that land. And so that's the 5 books of Moses. It actually has the establishment of the laws where God tells them, become a nation, a priest, follow my decrees and my ordinances, and you must follow them to have my land, but you're going to teach it to others too. And so for about 1,500 years, the Jews maintained that land and were considered a holy nation. And then Christ came into the picture. By the way, he was a Jew. So he already had that knowledge. He grew up with the 5 books of Moses and he was teaching the way. Now, the way is simple, tactical stuff like treat the rich and the poor evenly. You know, don't have skewed scales. Make sure you pay your workers immediately. You don't wait on people's wages. You don't steal. You don't lie. You don't cheat. You don't gossip. Now, if you were to just hand children a book of these things to do, it would be called the 5 books of Moses. And that's why I encourage people to constantly not only read it themselves, but it's all put together for us. You see, a man like Abraham was doing that on his own volition. And it was so powerful that 4,000 years from that man's existence, we still know who he exists. We actually know where his burial is. We can visit it in Israel, and we can confirm these things through archaeology, and it's quite amazing. So we now have to observe reality from the historical narrative and how we ended up here. So as a young man who's looking for God, first of all, he's around everywhere all the time. You know, all of us, I think, are byproducts of men and women having children, right? And so I would encourage people to continue that to the best of their issues. And right now, we're dealing with a serious issue. You're how old? You're 14, right? So I'm 25, okay? He's 24, he's 24. And we live in the same generation where most people are not getting married. A lot of promiscuity is out there. There's no really alternatives to being having a woman in your life. You see, there was something very interesting that happened to me personally over the weekend talking to my nieces and nephews, and my niece is 8 and 11. And I was just going on a walk with them and talking, and they wanted to bring up already, what do you want to do with the future of your life? And it's, I want to be a career this, a career that, career. And so I just posed a question to them, like, well, what about being a wife and a mother? Like, who else can do that job except women, right? And it's like, yeah, but you know, I only want to have 1 kid, or I want to have 2 kids, right? Because then I want the kids to have friends. Now, I've heard this a lot, like in high school and college through having lots of conversations. But when there's young girls who are children themselves, already putting a limitation on how many children they're supposed to have, when a man like Abraham, who caused all of this goodness to the earth, quite literally struggled to have children all the way up until the age of 100 years old, where he had that promised child, right? And so you're telling me now that children don't want to have children. They're saying, I don't want to have kids because it hurts my body. So there is propaganda targeting young girls and young boys that is seriously negative, okay? And the only way to combat that is, what is a man? What is a woman? Who is God, right? And if we can humble ourselves to this existence, it ultimately comes through service and self-improvement. And that's why we discuss things like the story of Cain. Yeah, what's up?
But most of that why women are not getting married is because there's less freedom today than it was, let's say, when I grew up. Because I'm older than you, that's fine.
Yeah.
It was a lot more freedom back then, a lot more money.
Yeah.
You just didn't have to work.
Well, you know that the modern girl says that there was less freedom then, and that now, no, it's propaganda. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I agree with you. But it's
Laws-wise, let's say laws, there's some stuff that they allow today that they didn't allow back then. But certain things. But overall, back then, there was nobody watching. You know, laws are just a suggestion. Remember that. If you're not going to do it at a certain extent, extreme level, I personally don't think there is nothing wrong with most things, a lot of things. But there was a lot more freedom back then. People just didn't have to work. People were out looking for a boyfriend or girlfriend. Uh, you had money, you had clothes, you had things. Today, you can't. Let's say back then you were even able to survive if you were one person. Let's say if your parents passed away, you were still able to get back on your feet. You have no relatives or you're stranded. Even stranded people were able to make it at least to a certain point. They can get started. Today, that doesn't exist. There's a lot of things you see with a lot of things that you don't see that doesn't exist today that used to exist back then. That perished like around 2005, 2000.
Well, back to my whole point about Egyptians and how they enslaved a nation and how we're living now and how actually the Jews themselves held on to that slave culture to get an idea of what actually happened in the Israelites. And I wanted to talk about this because we try and help with addiction, right? That we have this self-destructive behavior in general where we destroy ourselves. All of this 10 plagues, splitting the sea, miracles of all kinds, right? First of all, 10 times do the Jews complain over the course of just getting between there and to the land of Israel, which is not that much time. And they're saying things like, let's go back to Egypt to where we had fish and bread to eat to satiety, you know? We don't want this spiritual food, right? Can you imagine the disaster and like the slave culture and mindset almost of these people who are having a form of Stockholm syndrome, right? They just want to go back to their abusers, basically. And it shows a lot about our own nature because when we actually reach the land of Israel, we have God of the universe, the one who created everything, telling the Jewish people, oh, you're going to be able to take the land. It's yours, right? They get there and they complain instantly. We can't win. They have giants there. We're not going to be able to overtake them. And Joshua and Caleb were saying, no, the land is perfect. Surely we can overdo it. Ignore these guys. They keep pushing further and further. And then God says, all right, I had enough. You guys are going to wander the desert for 40 years, and this whole nation is going to die out, and your children are going to receive it. And, you know, people are like, oh man, it's such crazy judgment. Like, you know, you do all this and then you're just going to go kill off that nation. It's like, well, no, he didn't kill off the nation, right? He allowed them to live out 40 years for the rest of their lives. And then he allowed their children to have this land. So that's a very kind God, considering how much they mistreated God himself. And you see people have this misconception with God in general. It's like, you know, why doesn't he give me that thing that I want? Or, you know, why am I not able to, you know, why is all this sickness and death in this world? And it's like, remember, God actually already actively performed miracles for us. This stuff has already happened. It's been documented. It doesn't work. Actually, the Israelites' response after they got that terrible curse was, you know what? We're sorry. We want the land. And then Moses was saying, don't go to the land. If you go in there, they're going to kill you. They didn't listen to Moses. They went in there and they got killed. That's what happened, right? And then they went to the whole story of wandering through the desert for 40 years. But you see this self-destruction nature that we have. And I think it's directly related to addiction as well, because you can go so long, right, without doing anything. And then, well, you relapse, right? You relapse. And then it might be 40 years wandering in the desert. And so I highly encourage people struggling with addiction in any fashion to not take that next step, but that God is also infinitely kind and he will still allow you to live out your life where their food never diminished, their feet never bruised, their clothes, they never had to get a new set. So this 40 years of wandering in the desert also had God overwatching them the whole time, allowing them to flourish enough that their own children would get the land. So that's just an encouraging point for people who are doing that. And I hope that kind of gives you a bit of a direction on where to look, because we already discussed the 5 books of Moses story. Then there's something called the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, which talks about the Jewish history in 1500 years after the giving of the 5 books and the establishment of that nation. And then Christ comes into the picture, and it's pretty easy to keep track of when he was, because we're in year 2025. We are counting from the death of Christ until now. So he, again, was a Jew trying to follow the way, and there were people who wanted to stop him. That's the basic story. And then the rest of the world got that story of Christ attached to the Old Testament, attached to the 5 books of Moses. And so if you start at the beginning, then it'll all make sense to you. So I have to encourage many Christians in general, start at the beginning. You have to start at the beginning or else it's not going to make sense. There are no books that you read in reverse. I don't recommend that you do that. And there's nothing particularly special about the 5 books. It's a limited piece of work. It has something to share. It's short and concise, and use it. Don't get lost in that material. And so we're here to, again, help you when you have questions and when you want to know these things. You can talk to any of us, and we're here for it. So I hope that kind of puts things together for you. I'm going to pass the mic over this way everybody gets a chance to speak. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I think I'll go a little bit more on that because...
I'd recommend asking if anybody else has more questions.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Any things that you'd like to talk about?
It's a specific question. I'm sorry.
So he was asking about just kind of the history of God and who is God, and then how that relates to Christ and Jesus. So I figure I'll just give a little more background on that. Also, I think one of the simple ways to differentiate between God and Christ is by name and by title. So in the Old Testament and the Torah, you have God the Creator, right? God who is there from the beginning, from Genesis, and that God's name is Jehovah, right? So if you've seen those people walking around, the Jehovah's Witnesses, right? They're actually referring to the God Jehovah. In the 5 books of Moses and in the Old Testament, the God Jehovah is the Father, right? He, as it even says in Deuteronomy, it says, and this is to the point Dan was mentioning earlier about how we often feel angry with God. But there's a beautiful song at the end of the 5 books, which Moses says, I'm going to write down this song for you, and this song will be a response for the coming generations. Because he says you're going to find yourself in a time, and he literally prophesizes this future time, where God will have concealed his face to such an extent that we won't even know, like, is there a God, or what in the world is going on? Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
God's name is written as Jehovah.
Yes.
When was this written?
This is written all the way from the beginning of the Bible.
You're talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses, right?
Well, I was just giving that as a reference point.
Witnesses can't wait.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Only 100 years.
100%. I'm not talking about the movement. I was giving that as a reference to where you might have heard the name Jehovah.
I think Jehovah is just the name they use to represent God, but I didn't think his name was actually...
Oh, no, it is. It absolutely is. Yeah, in Hebrew, it is pronounced Yehovah, but is very clearly, or Yahweh is another variation of that. But that is the name of God in the Old Testament. There's no doubt about that. I've read the Old Testament.
Testament is the Orthodox Protestant. That's where I'm Protestant, because that's where Christianity came from. Catholics came after, later, Orthodox Protestants.
Mm-hmm.
The emperor seized all of Europe. The pagans that wanted to convert to Christianity would become...
Well, I mean, what do you think God's name is?
God has no name. They just call it the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Yes, but if you were to read the Bible, God does say what his name is. He actually tells Moses in Exodus, my name is Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is my remembrance for all eternity. And so God actually does provide us with a name, and the name is Jehovah, Yehovah, Yahweh.
Jesus also said it was here before.
That's correct. Yeah, Jesus does say that. But when it comes down to what statements are we going to take seriously, at the end of the day, from the beginning, we are seeing God as Yahweh, the Father, right? And then when you then go into the New Testament, we're introduced to a character named Jesus, the Son, right? And so that's the differentiation that I want to make, is that, even all human beings are created in the image of God, right? And the process of birthing progeny, children, is described as having someone in your image. It says when Adam gave birth to his son, he begot Seth in his likeness and his image, right? Even God will say to the Israelites, "You are my children," right? And so I believe we're all God's children, so we would all be God's sons. So Jesus is this messianic figure to people because he represents the Son, right, of God, and he's telling people to treat each other kindly and to follow the Father. But ultimately, the Father is God, and that's very self-evident in the biblical narrative, and so that's even clear in Deuteronomy, again, which is the 5th book of the Bible. God says, I am your Father, so don't think that I would do you wrong, right? And he says, as a father disciplines his son, so too Yahweh your God disciplines you. And so we're given a very clear picture of who God is, in fact. He is the Father, he is Yahweh. He is the one who created the earth, and he is the one who provides us with all of the laws. And I like how you mentioned the honoring your parents, right? Because that's the 5th commandment of the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments are Father God speaking to the children of Israel, telling them these are the 10 fundamental principles of morality, that if you were to follow them, you would be righteous in my eyes. And so to know that everything originates from the original source, right? Even if you just break down what comes first, right? The Father or the Son, right? The Father, right? So you have the Father, and then we have what comes from the Father, what the Father begets, what the Father births. We're fortunate enough to have been created by God, to have been created in his image, and to really be the children of God in the flesh, all of us. Like God managed to create human beings in the flesh in his image. And I think that's an extremely powerful thing. I think it's not something to take lightly. And again, when you read the Bible from the beginning, it's very clear that God is the Father, God is Jehovah, and he's the one who's providing us with his guidance. And just to conclude, this song that's in the end of the 5 books of Moses, so Moses says there's going to come a time where God conceals his face, and people are going to say, is there no God among us? Is that why, all of these evils have found us? Like, where is God? And that's clearly the dialogue that we hear, like if you'll ever hear an atheist, for example, debating God, well, where is God? And, fair enough, I suppose. But at the same time, Moses says, you have to understand there's a response. The reason why you don't see God is because God literally concealed his face due to the fact that we are unworthy of gazing upon God in our state of sin and disobedience. And so Moses writes down this song, and he says, this song will serve as a response to you in these later times when you wonder, where is God? And when you read the song says, Moses says, I will testify before heaven and earth, and let the earth give ear and listen. And he says, you're going to attribute falsehood to God. You're going to say, oh, God is corrupt. Look, God is unfair. And he says, how can you possibly say something like that? He is your Father. He is your master. He made you and he established you. At the end of the day, there's really 2 options here. Either we're wrong and God is right, or God is wrong and we're right. And what is the likelihood that God is wrong? There's 0 chance, right? God is obviously so far above us, so much greater than us. And so if we were to take the message of this final song in the Torah being the 5 books of Moses, it's telling us that whatever point in history we find ourselves in, if we do feel at odds with God or at odds with existence, and there's something that's bothering us about what we're going through, you know what? We need to take a measure of humility.
Wasn't Jehovah a witness of God? Because that's what's written in the Testament. I don't think, because God was a spirit. He never became a human.
Yeah, I'm not saying God is a human. I'm just saying that's his name. But the reason why I mentioned Jehovah's Witnesses is just because that's a group of people that use his name.
That said he witnessed God.
No. The
Testament is only something years old. It doesn't date.
The Old Testament's 100 years old?
No, the Jehovah's Witness Testament is no older than it's like.
Yes, I'm really sorry for even bringing up Jehovah's Witnesses. The reason why I brought it up,
A lot older than the version you're.
yes, I'm not talking about,
There's the Protestant Orthodox
yes,
version, which
to be clear,
are old.
I'm not talking about the Jehovah's Witness religion. I was just,
But that only the Jehovah's.
no, that's the Jehovah's Witnesses using the name Jehovah, which preexists what?
God does not have a name. It also says that
Where?
in the Bible.
No, it doesn't.
Yes, it does.
Where does it say that?
Which Bible did you read?
The same Bible you have.
You know, they're all different.
No, that's not true.
No, yes, they are. Trust me. They're way different from each other. For example, the Catholics have.
Well, where in the Bible does it say God doesn't have a name?
I'm just to kind of like quash this whole thing, which is excellent, by the way. I love this sort of pushback. Just bring your Bible. We'll show you. It's the same thing. I promise you. I could show you right now. Yud He Vav He is how they write it in the Hebrew. The Hebrew pre-existed 1,500 years prior to Christ even being born, right? And so Christ used that literature to teach other people. That's what he did. And we have that written down in the New Testament. And you and I can both take our Bibles. We could sit down and we could look. We can say, okay, this is Jesus. This is Jehovah. This is Adonai. This is Elohim. This is kind of a negative thing that tends to happen a lot amongst groups in general, which is what we're so focused on the name of God. Obviously, God has limitless names, and he is a limitless being, right? And so in concept, I agree with you. I think we all agree.
Because I know you're Jewish. You guys back before the Bible. But remember, I'm also Armenian. When God flooded the earth, the Father, the Son, which is, the Adam and Eve, which was Abel and
Same. Mhm.
Yeah, he killed his brother because it was the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which was God created that. And God
Okay.
never became human form. God was
No, we're not talking
Yeah,
about
we're
God
not
in
dis-
human form at all.
yeah,
We
we're
don't
not-
think that God is a human.
Noah's Ark landed in Mount Ararat.
That's correct. And by the way, I'd like to confirm that fact. How so? I can open Genesis and I can read. Yeah, and I can read Noah's Ark landed on Ararat.
Mhm.
So we're just confirming historical facts through the literature. And by the way, you do have a Bible at home, yes?
Yes, I do.
Please bring it. Please bring it next week.
Some countries also have different theories of where the Garden of Eden was.
Sure. By the way, the theories and the discussions around the literature are actually endless. They're endless.
So let's say some people say it was in Africa, some people say it was in Persia, some people say it was in Saudi Arabia or other countries.
But you would dispute that fact,
Yeah,
right?
because if Noah's Ark landed in Mount Ararat, that means where did we come?
But what's your best piece of evidence to show that? What's your best piece of evidence to show that? I'd like to give it to you. It's called the 5 Books of Moses. It quite literally says the ark landed in Ararat. And it's unchanged literature. This is a misconception that we have about the typical Bible. I promise you.
Come from Africa.
No, Noah built it. Noah built it.
Where?
Where did he build it?
Garden of Eden, right?
No,
No.
Noah's after the Garden of Eden.
No,
Mhm.
remember the guy was the whole earth was flooded, and then after he was moving around, the waters dissipated, and he landed on Ararat. Right now, by the way, I'm in support of that fact, but it's more evidence. You see, you can't point at the ark in Ararat and say this is why Noah landed here. People know that fact because it says it in the literature, and if you come to me with the King James Bible, it says the same thing. There is a misconception that all of our Bibles do not line up. That is a lie.
Because it's
Come
different.
to me with the Bible. I promise you'll see it's the same thing. It's miraculous. It really is. And so I just wanted to step in to
Yeah,
try and be helpful in that regard. Actually,
I do want to
Chris
say,
could.
I want to add on to that. There's something that I discovered through Shirley's help, Israel, is that every Bible does conceal God's name just out of respect, right? So they,
Okay, the
like in
Lord.
the Lord or God or Hashem, I think those are the 3 main ones. And they purposely leave it out just to like not use God's name because it could violate one of the commandments to not use his name in vain. But that's also kind of debatable. whether or not you're using his name in vain just by saying his name. And as you can see, surely he's using it in the right context. He's not using his name in vain to convey an evil message. He's using it to teach. So it's a good thing. And if you read it and you read his name, you're reading a holy book. So it's okay that you say Yahweh or Jehovah.
Just not to perpetrate the image of God. That's why they use the name.
Well, that's actually why they don't use it.
Yeah.
No, they use different names.
Correct.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yahweh. Yeah. I wanted to add on to what you said because it's really touched on this as well, but you posed a question and then you added context to your question. And that context, correct me if I'm wrong, was that you're just like kind of going about life, like hanging out with friends. You mentioned, I don't know if I heard this right, but you said you're disrespectful to your parents and you want to fix that.
Yeah.
Right. The fact that you're questioning yourself is already showing that you're on the right path. Right? You're questioning it just because you feel like it's wrong. And at this point, you're 14. I thought you were older, by the way. But you're 14, you're very young. And at this point, you're very inexperienced, but you're still human and you take in everything just as we take in everything ourselves. So you're not in any way in a lower position. But you are very inexperienced, and that's a fact. And do you have a mother and father at home? Great. So that is one of the commandments, right? Honor your parents. And it's a hard thing to reason why you should, but at this point in your age, you have to attach yourself to some sort of foundation and trust in the process, right? There's wisdom for a reason. You've heard wisdom in many different sayings, and there's like a million different pieces of phrases that somehow ring true internally. And one of them is honoring your parents. Like, if it's questionable whether or not you should talk back to them or go against them, always just play it safe. Do not go against them, and you'll reap the benefit and you'll live a long life if you do that. Now, as far as your friends go, there's something that I experienced. Originally, I wanted to talk about slavery and its moral implications, but then last night I had a weird series of dreams, and the first one, I don't remember exactly who I was speaking to. It was kind of like an unknown figure. He kept saying, "In the beginning of Mark, in the beginning of Mark." And then I woke up and I started reading the beginning of Mark, which is one of the books in the New Testament. But I'll get back to that later. The second dream, I was on this speedboat in Africa, and it was like sandy waters and murky. And I was on this top deck, and we hit a rock, and we get launched into the mouth of a cave. And in the cave were Somali pirates, and they took us. And there was this like dark pit in the ground, and it was probably like the length of a average like 5'6" human. And I saw this like film that kind of gave it away that it was water, but it was just completely dark inside. So as they shined a flashlight, I just saw like 10 or 15 men under the water, not moving, chained by yellow chains to like some rock. They were just, some of them were dead, some of them I couldn't tell. But they weren't like squirming, and they took one of them out. And he starts breathing, and I'm terrified. I'm like, shit, like this is my fate. And like, I don't know what to do. And I'm terrified, and I didn't want to go into the waters, obviously. But the reason why I didn't want to go into the waters was because I had this foundation of what I know to be true about the human body and its condition. You cannot breathe without air, right? So you'll die. But what I didn't think of is who my Savior is, right? Anything's possible with God. And when I woke, first thing I did was bring out the book of Mark. I was like, I'll just take it as a sign, right? Like, I experienced this. Dreams are weird, and I'm just going to read it. So I read it, and there was a lot of things that I took in. And I came across one of the first parables, which is about the seed, right? Sowing your seed. And Jesus says, you throw your seed by the wayside, and it will get snatched up by birds, right? It won't even hit the ground. You throw it by the stony path, and it'll hit the ground, but it'll sprout, and because it cannot sink into the ground, the sun will scorch it, so the seed dies off. Throw it in the thorn bush and it gets choked up by the thorn bush. But if you throw it on soil, fertile soil provided by God, that's kind of the message there. It'll grow and reap tenfold, 100-fold, depending on the person. And that parable, I remember when I first came across it, I was kind of like, I'm not like a poetry guy, like I'm not going to understand this. But then he explains it to his disciples, and he says, like, the obvious connection is that, like, depending on where you throw your word, your seed to different people, it'll get taken up by some and not by others. And what I took from that parable is that if you treat yourself as that piece of seed, or if you yourself are living and you get tossed the seed of truth, depending on where you're at, whether you're in the thorn bush around bad men or kids that like have no direction, or just people in general, you're not going to grow. If you're on a stony path where there's no foundation underneath you, you're not going to grow. If you're on the wayside, like you don't even have a chance. It's not even going to sink into you. So you're doing the right thing in coming here and knowing that you are in a foundation rooted by God. And I just want to give you some, I guess, acknowledgement that what you're doing is clearly the path that's unique to you. And if you just take it in, however you take it, then it'll be good for you in the end. Like nothing's a coincidence. Everything's special to you. Everything that's been said to you as well.
Beautiful. Very well.
Okay. Wow. Beautiful things. Everyone. I'm interested in your original comment about, actually, I was talking to you too earlier, the young man here. It says, life is not for sissies, and we were talking about that. There's make yourself tough, because it's going to be required. And that's not simply physically, but it certainly includes physically, and it means mentally and spiritually, primarily. And the physical is a nice one if God permits it. And if he does, then develop that too. But going to the underlying question, to switch subject back to your first question, that things aren't the same economically.
Yeah, well, not just economically, overall.
Yeah, that's right. And that's because the actually in California, I believe it's 1967, that the teaching of the Bible in public school was outlawed. But that's the foundation. That's the thing. When you take that out, you suddenly see all the prophecies that Dan and Israel was alluding to, and the simple knowledge of the Christian parable that you were alluding to is just out of the culture. That used to be the common air. It used to be the common sense. So President Truman, well, okay, that's interesting because he's quite a God-fearing man in many ways. Yeah.
The one who allowed the central banks there.
Excuse me, 1967, I'm talking California ran the private school. Truman's way before 1967.
Yeah, I know. But he established the Central Intelligence Agency in 60.
All right, that's true, but two things can be true at once. So the CIA was established then, and now we're talking about a different subject, which is the elimination of making it forbidden to teach anything having to do with the Bible, which is idiotic, since that's what motivated people for many centuries. And caused civilization to shift, and caused the Spanish to establish Christian dioceses under the Catholic rubric, and later British and French to establish their provinces in North America, and it was under a Christian rubric that was the common sense. So what we're talking about is the elimination of common sense. Let me go to another point. Just to the simple economic point, there is a phrase called capitalism, which is misunderstood. The term of art was defined by Karl Marx to be a pejorative on the system which we would otherwise call peaceful voluntary exchange. Now, that term of art is coined by Walter Williams, one of the great economists of the 20th century and the 21st century. And by the way, he's a black man, so he's the genius. Genius is well distributed among the races, you know. So, and it's not uniquely Jewish or uniquely any particular people. But think about this meaning: peaceful voluntary exchange. If you look at history, and by the way, the teaching of history was corrupted since 1967. Some people just don't know anything. So the common sense was eliminated. And if you think it, but a cursory look at history is wherever people were allowed to engage in peaceful voluntary exchange, based on the fact that we have a common frame of reference, that there's such thing as honesty and integrity, if you will, the 10 Commandments, you know, and we all sort of get that's right, and we can trust each other, then those societies prosper. And wherever that's not the case, they go down. And that's simply an axiom of history. There are no exceptions. And even in America, which became the 20th century powerhouse, and even into the early part of the 21st century, things started to change as a construct of people turning away and voting away with their rights as free citizens the idea that peaceful voluntary exchange is a good thing. What is a good thing instead is the terms are communism or socialism, the idea that we should have the government orchestrate interactions between people. That wrecks everything all the time, every time. So bottom line is we need this fundamental return to the common sense that built civilization. And I think you guys hammered eloquently this point, but it is good to do what Dan was saying, bring your Bible, and we'll see that there's a common frame. Everyone acknowledged, and Christian scholars are excellent, so you can rely on them on Hebrew, just as you can rely on the Jewish scholars for an honest interpretation of the language. But so the idea of, they know Hebrew very well, and it's very clear that the name of God, which is referred to as in Hebrew Yehovah, but coined by the recent group, the Jehovah Witness, they're only using a name that was there, and specifically it comes into play in the book of Genesis in only when it's the first time it's written, and it's 4 letters, and they can't be mistaken by anybody. Even if you're not a Hebrew scholar, you can recognize 4 letters. And when it gets used is in Genesis 2, verse 4. So just for the record, you can look that up. And you won't need to be a scholar. You can just look at, this is what you can have any of us who have some familiarity with Hebrew, and Israel is like the expert. I'm decent. Dan is good. He's great, you know, on language. But even a child could do this. So it's not a complicated thing. And people who are not fluent in Hebrew have recognized this without dispute. This is not a dispute. You follow amongst any of the religions. Everyone's on the same page with what it says. So that's a good thing. So let's return to the common sense. There are idiotic things. People don't know anything. The idea, I was started last week about discussing the difference, the mentality in which a person has to do a study to say which animal is taller, a giraffe or a mouse. And the fact is, you can have people who will say, well, obviously a giraffe is taller. That would be the common sense, you know, nothing to discuss. And then people say, well, scientifically speaking, you know, we haven't measured all the mice and all of the giraffes, and until when the data's in, finally, I'll give you a definitive answer. That, of course, is the answer of either a fool or a liar, you know, and he's got it. They've got, the fools should be ignored summarily, and liars should be ignored summarily because they have an agenda that's against you. Now, simple things like, so what is history? You'll actually understand the narrative by reading from any Bible. Let's take the King James Bible as a generic thing that was most operating for many years. That's the narrative of existence that everyone accepted, you know, going right from in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, to the story of Noah and the flood, through the patriarchs and through Moses and the Jews at Mount Sinai, and what the 10 Commandments are, and the narrative of the Jews eventually going into the Old Testament, taking over the land, and finally bringing us up to 2,000 years ago when Jesus was on his particular mission, right? And that's accepted as the narrative of history. And it wasn't until the 1850s that anybody even disputed that. When theorists went to the Fertile Crescent, which the Bible directed them to, and found evidence of civilization, and then archaeology develops. Now, there's some good things about that. Basically, they found evidence that everything is true. But there's also people saying, well, I want to be scientific, and I want to eliminate mankind's collective memory and speculate on my own to make a name for myself, is essentially what's going on. And based on this shard of glass, a shard of stone or ceramic, or a tooth, as Israel mentioned, I will postulate that. And all the evidence of mankind goes out the window, and a theory with no support except a piece of broken stone. Instead of, if you guys wrote a biography of your life, even a recent memory of the last 3 or 4 days, and you just said, this is what I did. Okay, what is more likely, that there's true things, more true what you said, or what someone who wasn't near you didn't see what you were doing and what they said? That would be idiotic, you know. So that's exactly what archaeology became, although there's some useful information in it, because even a broken clock is right twice a day, as the expression goes, right? So anyway, reading it for yourself, this is the whole thing. It's not about any of us standing here and saying, I have knowledge that you don't have and could never have, which is the position of a lot of people in religious authority. What we're here to say is, I have some knowledge because I simply read the book. You could read it, and you would almost certainly be much more knowledgeable and much smarter than me, and that would be a good thing. That's all we want you guys to do. Read it for yourself, become knowledgeable. It is literally an IQ booster for wherever you are. And if you're already a high IQ person, you're going to go off the charts. And if you're just in the middle of the road, you're still going to go off the charts. So why not do it? Take advantage of it. That's essentially what everything's saying, I think. All right, I'll pass you that. Here you go. All right.
All right, fantastic. One thing just about this organization, ISU, boxing, everything that's going on, we would like to run a fundraiser to get this going. Okay. Now, again, this sort of talk, giving people the ability to have a learning curve to improve themselves, to physically interact with life and to grow is really the goal here, because lots of people, particularly in addiction, if they don't have anything to do after, they just want to go back. I know I use that Egypt story, right? Where you got 40 years, you get taken out of slavery and you do all this stuff, and then you get to the point where you reject God and you relapse, right? You don't want to be like the Israelites who didn't listen to Moses, who continued doing drugs and then get, so to speak, killed, right? You can live out the next 40 years in the desert under God's protection and blessing. Okay, so you have an opportunity. Don't go deeper. These fundamental truths give people metaphor and reality that touches so true to their existence that they can get better. And beyond that, all of this is about living. It's about working. If you're a man, you got to live, you got to work, right? We all have our blood, sweat, and tears here in this particular gym, and we've seen it help people. So we want to help more people who are coming out of the house, people who just got out of a program. You know, we can't have people here, of course, who are non-functioning. They need to be in a different type of home. But there are people who, again, want to put themselves on the straight and narrow, as you say, and get a new started life. People who've been post-incarceration. That is the other niche that we want to touch base on. Educating the children. If this has been removed from the school system since the 60s, imagine what the modern iPad kid is getting in his head. So people like us want to build an education center. We want to build a rehabilitation center. We want to get people jobs and working. We're about equipping people with individuality and godliness. And so I encourage you guys to share this with other people, that this door is open for anybody who needs it. But we'd physically like to run a fundraiser, and we're getting some help. The ideas that we have for now to get people to walk into the door, we plan on doing some mass emailing, is giving haircuts and some free food, maybe even getting a mock match in the gym so that some of our amateurs can fight, or students could fight each other and put on a bit of a show for people. And that's something that you guys are all a part of. We plan on getting a date for that. We plan on moving towards that. If you guys have anybody that you can talk to or you want me to talk to, just shoot my number a text or come knock on my office. Okay, God bless you all. Thank you so much for coming.